on the issue of preference and heterogeneity. We're very much looking forward to your talk.
I just need to start recording the video.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very, very much for inviting me, Ravi. And it's a great presentation, so it's a wonderful thing to have followed. My talk is based on an introduction to a symposium on the effect of society on preferences. So what my talk, based on work with Ernst Fehr, is about is a big idea. And I draw on some of our work, some of my work, and some of many other people's work as well, including the work of others in the symposium, which is coming out very soon. The galleys are in my suitcase in the Economic Journal. As economists, the first thing that we teach our students is when we want to explain why behavior changes, we say, think about changes in the constraints. So we look at income, we look at relative prices, we look at externalities, we look at technological changes, and all the time we're maintaining the assumption that preferences are fixed and preferences are the same for all groups. Why do we have that assumption? The reason we have that assumption is because economists have to start somewhere. And until about 2 decades ago, we didn't have the kinds of experimental and other procedures like we've been seeing all day today, instrumental variables and so on, to really get a fix on what preferences might be. We also had such a narrow view of preferences, stars that would have been completely laughable 20 years ago. We had such a narrow view, we had such a false view that it really wasn't possible to think about changes in preferences, because if you don't know the model, how can you assess changes in the model? All that has changed. On the one hand, we now really know, at least in some ways, how preferences work and how to test them, with respect to risk, with respect to social preferences, with respect to time discounting. And on the other hand, we've gotten much more sophisticated econometrically, so we can do a lot, not just with field experiments, but even with observational data. And finally, what's happened is that game theory has just gotten completely explosive in its generation of variables, like do you have 3-stage games? Do you choose prices? Do you choose quantities? What is it you assume about the other person's assumption about you? And so on. And that gives us all kinds of free variables. So it used to be that the excuse in a famous paper by Stigler and Becker, the excuse was you couldn't think about preferences because that was just sloppy thinking. That was just lazy thinking. It introduces free variables, infinite free variables. But so do many game theoretic models. So the upshot is, point 1 of this talk, which I'm just summarizing so that I can move on to the more interesting or fun stuff, is that methodologically, the concern with too many free variables applies just as much to theoretical constraints as it does to theories about preferences. So that on methodological grounds, if you're worried about sort of easy thinking, circular thinking, you should be just as concerned, at least in strategic situations, about focusing on changes in the constraints as you are, as Becker and Stigler were, about thinking about changes in preferences. This talk has 2 parts. I've summarized the introduction, sort of motivation. We can think about preferences now, but we still have a big, big problem. How do you really identify causal factors in changes? That's quite difficult. So the first thing I'm going to do is something easier. I'm going to try to persuade you that there are psychological mechanisms that I'll even try to demonstrate to you while you're sitting here that make it plausible that preferences are very susceptible to social influences. So if I can, take away any prejudices you might have on that score, then I will go on to the more speculative part of the talk, which is about preference-based explanations that might help explain outstanding puzzles, like, for example, the well-known puzzle that there's a big difference across countries in the demand for social insurance. Famously, there's a big difference between most Western European countries and the US, and why is that? So those are the two parts, and now I'll begin with part one, framing effects. So the first part of this talk, or most of this talk, is really all about framing effects. I'm going to use framing effects as a metaphor. I'm going to argue that social institutions create framing effects. But before I use it as a metaphor, I want to use it literally. So when I mean frame, it's a frame I could put on a picture. People often assume that what they see with their own eyes is a correct representation of reality. I'm old enough that I don't think that anymore. But I'm a lot older than most of the people here. Most people here probably think that. But in fact, our perception of objects is shaped by context. This looks like a checkerboard. Look at the square labeled A and the square labeled in B. What is the relationship between the colors of A and B? Okay, you can think in your mind. Okay, now I'm going to demonstrate. There's A. I've taken it out of its frame. You see? B. Take it out of its frame. They're the same color. Same color. Okay, I didn't cheat. I didn't cheat. So I'll do it one more time. Okay. So it's the frame. There's actually many colors in this checkerboard. It's not really a checkerboard at all. This is a very famous illusion, and I'm sure this is familiar to at least half of you. As you know from, if you know this illusion, you know that the two orange lines are the same length, but clearly they don't look the same length. Because the difference in the way the arrows goes, sort of the left-hand side makes you sort of feel constrained. And the right-hand side, I don't know, you just feel like you're expanding. And so the right-hand side looks longer. This is a fairly familiar picture. So what does it look like? Obviously, it's two things. It's a duck if you focus on the bill, but it's a rabbit if you focus on the nose. I like them both. I haven't decided which I like better. But the point of this picture is, it's two things, but at any one time, you kind of just see one. It's really hard to see both of them at the same time. And that's because when we look at things, we have kind of theories. We bring a lot to everything we see. That's why we all see different things. But to the extent that we all share the same society, a lot of the prejudices we have are the same. And that has very interesting implications for economics, as I'll try to persuade you. When I look at the eye, I actually see a little man. So there's just a lot of things going in this picture. A face. He has a nose and so one eye. You only see one eye. Okay, I've now established, I hope to your satisfaction, that frames really matter. Now I'm going to use frames as a metaphor. I'm going to say that frames shape your preferences. Not just what you see, but what you think you want. So the idea of framing effects is really from Goffman, Sociology, 1974, but it's now used all the time in economics, and it's really defined as anything that's irrelevant from a traditional perspective of what is the rational assessment of your alternatives, and yet really matters. So it might matter because it triggers a particular way of thinking about a choice. You think you're choosing about a duck, or you think you're choosing about a rabbit. Determining what details of a set of choices are salient, or you just stop after the first 10 choices because you can't cope after that. So you only choose among the first 10, and the 11th never gets chosen by anyone. Or evoking a self-concept, a norm or a worldview. And I think Nava Ashraf's talk, at least if I understood it correctly, seems to be moving towards the idea that stars might have worked so well because they evoke a particular self-concept and make you enjoy sharing that self-concept with others in your group. So the bigger your sort of peer group, the more you like your stars. And, ultimately, the item that we consume more than anything else is how we feel about ourselves. Example from a very famous and really fun paper, Coherent Arbitrariness. The study elicits willingness to pay in a very nice incentive-compatible way for various goods, like a bottle of wine or a cordless mouse. For each item, subjects are asked whether they're willing to pay more or less than a certain price. The price, okay, that's the first thing you do. That's the anchor. So the price is based on the last 2 digits of your Social Security number, okay? So you're John Doe. The last 2 digits are 19. So you form a price out of that. So you're asked, would you be willing to pay for some, tracking ball or bottle of wine, $19, yes or no? And then after that, the experiment elicits the willingness to pay in standard ways. Here's the result. If your Social Security number, last 2 digits, is between 00 and 39, then you'll consistently offer less for every single item. And if the last 2 digits are between 40 and 99, and I just picked those, I could have picked anything. I was trying to get the median, but he didn't give me enough information in the published paper to get the median, and so that's how come it's divided like this. So those guys who happen to get a Social Security number that was high will pay high. So do you understand? Something that is A, irrelevant, and B, that is common knowledge is irrelevant, nonetheless anchors the way in which you value these goods. Isn't that nuts? Okay, you might say, well, there is not much money at stake. After all, the most we could possibly be talking about here is 99, and maybe nobody had a Social Security number that ended in 99. And anyway, who knows much about Cote-du-Rhône? I don't think I'd know Cote-du-Rhône if it fell on me. So it's really hard. I don't have much information, so thinking is painful. I learned this morning just how limited I am cognitively, that, if I'm thirsty what was it I learned? Oh, if I have to solve a more complicated game, then I'll always get the cake and not the fruit. Because I can't cope with thinking that fruit is better for me or something like that. So you could criticize this. So there's a follow-up experiment that I'll just summarize instead of showing you the numbers. You could say, well, the power of arbitrary numbers as anchors doesn't matter because you really can't remember what Cote-du-Rhône is. So they replicate the experiment where the individual has just experienced the object. The object is an annoying sound. You hear this annoying sound for, 30 seconds, and then you have to say how much you require to be paid to hear it again for certain periods of time. So there's no mystery about how annoying this sound is. And yet, you get exactly the same kind of result, that anchors really matter. Which suggests, to the extent that social institutions prime individuals' identities and act as anchoring and framing devices, to this extent, institutions also shape preferences. And, I've tried to kind of build this up so it all sounds reasonable, but that is a radical change from the way in which we teach most of our students most of the time about institutions. We teach them that the institutions are the rules of the game, but their preferences are the preferences. They're fixed. So this is a big difference. So now I'm going to try to show you 2 or 3 experiments where you can really see that these anchoring effects matter in tightly controlled experiments. So the first one is from Zender, and it's called Fairness Perceptions in Reservation Wages. And as you can guess from the title, the basic idea is the reservation wage, the willingness you are to work, and it's just a contract, nobody actually does any work in this experiment, but what you think of as a fair payment from a firm who is, in his experimental setup, making money off of contracting, depends on what the minimum wage is. The study elicits reservation wages before the introduction of a minimum wage, and then after abolishing the minimum wage. Minimum wages cause increases in reservation wages even after they've been abolished. Because, hey, if I think of myself as a $100 an hour person, after there's been a minimum wage, then you take it away, I'd never work for $50 again. It's insulting, or who knows. And there's no rationalization in terms of different constraints possible. Example 2. So a paper that I've just done based on data that I'd collected much earlier that I just never had time to properly deal with, is called Making Up People, which is a phrase that is the sort of title of an Ian Hacking, a sociologist, a paper where he discusses the idea that maybe there were no suicides before the 19th century. We came up with the idea of suicides. Maybe there were no homosexuals and heterosexuals before we came up with these concepts. Basically, he's exploring the idea, which is a famous idea in sociology, that concepts, ways in which we categorize people, actually change how we look at ourselves and how we think others look at us. And that certainly was a very important idea under colonialism, where, you know, races were created out of thin air, and they were created in different ways in different places. And even today, the definition of a black in some places is different from the definition of a white. A famous joke is some guy goes to Haiti and says, well, what's the percentage of whites in this country? And the guy says, oh, I don't know, 99%. And he says, really? Really? And he says, yeah, really. We use the one-drop rule just like you do. We just flip it. So in my experiment, what I did was I had high caste boys from different, well, high and low, but I'm only going to talk about the highs because only the highs illustrate clearly the effect of identity on preferences. Any change for the lows could easily be explained by stereotype threat, so an effect on ability, not preferences. So that's why I'm only talking about the high caste in these couple slides. So high caste boys from different villages solve mazes. And there's 6 guys in a session, and you earn 1 rupee for each maze. And there's 3 conditions. I bring the guys from different villages. So the 6 of you are sitting, you know, most of the time you've never seen these guys before, and so presumably you can't figure out what their caste is, and I don't say anything about the personal identity of the kids. In the next, that's the control treatment. Then in the next treatment, the experimenter looks at each of the 6 children, says she's just going to confirm some personal information, and then she says their name, their caste, their father's name, and their village name. And that's not an unreasonable thing to do, even in village schools where pretty much everybody knows everybody's caste. Caste is announced all the time. Uniforms are distributed on the basis of whether you're low caste or high caste. If you look at the registry books, it says everybody's caste status. It'll say John Doe, you know, 9/22/99 was his birth date, and then it says his caste category. So it's not an unreasonable thing to do. The difference between the second and third treatment is only in the composition of the 6 boys. In the second to last treatment, in the second treatment, there's 3 highs and 3 lows in the room. And, you know, so the child's name and caste, like Chamar or Brahmin, will be named. And these castes are local. Everyone knows who's the untouchable and who's the really high caste. I just took people from the very top and bottom of the caste hierarchy. And then in the last treatment, everyone's going to be high caste. And they would know this couldn't have happened by chance because there just aren't that many high caste kids. Plus, everyone was transported to the experimental site in a little car that included exactly 3, you know, or 5, exactly an equal number of high caste and low caste kids. So, presumably by segregating them, I'm giving them a very strong cue to the caste system. In 1 out of 4, so these are quotes from a survey of about 150 or more villages from all over India. In 1 out of 4 primary schools in rural India, Dalit, low caste, traditionally the untouchable children, are forced by their teachers or by convention to sit apart from the non-Dalits. As many as 40% of schools practice untouchability while serving midday meals, making Dalit children sit in a separate row while eating. So you see, segregation is something that would resonate with these children. Both the low caste and the high caste would know what it was cueing. And untouchability historically was a way for high caste people to get forced labor. It wasn't personal slavery, it wasn't chattel slavery like in the US, but it was the creation of a class of people who were denied any opportunities to work except for high caste people. They had no opportunities to get educated, no opportunities for anything but menial jobs. So it kept them in a slave-like status. So, you know, the kids all look the same. to me, well, nobody looks particularly low caste to me, but I look pretty cute. But some are low caste and some are high caste, and as I said, I bring them from all over. Oh, and they sit in a room, and they actually do eat together, which I realized only after the fact was meaningful. So they each have a maze, and I explained to them how they do mazes. 90 or so % of the children had never seen mazes before, so I'm not only testing effort, but I'm sort of testing effort in two ways. Effort in learning what it means to solve a maze, and then there's 30 minutes of maze solving in 2 different sessions. So it's effort over a really sustained period. And what do I get? So I have 2 rounds, 2 15-minute rounds. The light color means that identity is not revealed. The medium color is identity is revealed in a mixed caste group, and the dark color is identity is revealed in a segregated group. So as you can see in round 1, on average, the first 2 treatments were the same, but segregation lowered the effort of the high caste boys. And round 2 is just the same, except on average everyone does better because they've had a lot more experience solving mazes. Well, why is this? Individual output depends only on preferences and ability. There's nothing strategic here. There's nothing competitive in the treatment I'm describing. There's no plausible reason why the ability of the high caste kids should be impaired by placing them in sessions of only high caste boys. In fact, they learn better in the 2 conditions when caste is made public. When caste is not made public, the fraction of kids who failed is a little less, or maybe equal to 8%. And when caste is revealed, the fraction is just 2%. So it's not like they're upset by their name being called, because it's no sooner than their name and caste is called that the experimenter teaches them what it means to solve a maze. So they don't seem upset. They seem to be perfectly fine. The low caste has the exact opposite effect. So whatever segregation is signaling, it's helping the low caste, it's helping the high caste. Their failure rate goes down, and it's hurting the low caste. So it's reasonable to think this is something that's liked by the high caste. They like segregation. Somehow it acknowledges their status, but it's very aversive for the low caste. So why do they seem to expend less effort? Making caste highly salient might activate a mental frame in which a high caste person has less need to achieve, so less need to work hard. We've learned from the society in which we live a variety of roles, and we might be priming the role of sort of overseer who doesn't work. He gets other people to work for him, and his status, his wealth, his power depends on his caste, not on productive effort. Segregating by caste might act as a frame switch. More evidence on multiple preference orderings and frame switches. Do you know that if I take Asian Americans and I prime their Asian identity, they're more cooperative, less individualistic, and more patient? Priming a family-oriented identity triggers value related to family obligations. Priming an occupation-oriented identity triggers values related to obligations to one's firm. So it seems that we might want to think of ourselves as not under the unitary self model. We might want to recognize that we sort of have a portfolio of selves. That just as in Sendel's talk this morning, we don't seem to be able to think of everything at the same time. We sort of, if we're really great packers, then we're not going to be great planners. And if we're really great planners, we're not going to be great packers. Well, we have limited cognitive ability, and we can't even think of all our obligations at once, or all the ways we want to be, or all the norms we want to follow, or all the norms, other people expect us to follow. And if you look at it like that, then it's not so surprising that priming one or another identity, and by the way these primes work is you just have people fill out a questionnaire where you ask them about Asian restaurants versus American restaurants, or you just ask them a lot of questions that are about being Asian versus family versus occupation. So let's go back to our little duck and rabbit. You see, if I cover up his nose, he's a duck. And now he becomes more rabbit-like. So the idea is that just as when I look at an object and the light, if the light is imperfect, some part might be sort of less prominent or even not visible, and then I'll make a different assessment about what it is. In the same way, if my cognitive capacity is limited, then if you make me think about Asian friends and Asian restaurants and my parents having come from Asia, I'll start thinking of myself in a slightly different way than I would if you asked me about, how many years I've lived in America and about all my favorite American movies and how I like to eat French fries. I mean, we don't know, but that's the hypothesis. So now I'm moving to part 2 of the talk. This is more speculative. I'm going to be talking about preference-based explanations that can help explain outstanding puzzles. So obviously a famous puzzle in the world is, why is the caste system so stable in villages? Well, luckily it's not completely stable. It has changed a lot. It's always changed for thousands of years. Caste is a politically sort of entwined system. Its politics change, its caste changes, but still, it's surprisingly stable. And here's hypothesis 1. An individual's position in an extreme social hierarchy affects his willingness to punish violations of a cooperation norm. You'll see the connection in a minute. So I ran this test. So this started because I read a paper years ago, I think published in the year 2000 in the AER, one of those short papers in the back, that Ernst Fair did with a co-author, Simon Gokter. And just a beautiful paper about how you can resolve a social dilemma by giving people scope for punishing free riders at a cost to themselves. It's like a 10-page paper. It's really a pleasure to read, and I thought, gee, I want to do that in India. So I told him I wanted to do that in India. I just emailed him out of the blue, and then he said he wanted to do it in India too. So then he became my advisor, and that was very nice. So we wrote a paper called Caste and Punishment. We examined, and then we had, our brilliant Indian, my research assistant, who turned out to be so brilliant, I had to make him a co-author. So we examined the impact of caste status on punishment while controlling for in-group, out-group, wealth, education effects. We played a game. 3 guys interact. Players A, B, and C. Each man lives in a different and distant village. They never go near each other. They never know what villages the other people are from. A and B interact in a trust game. And C, so we have our A villages, our B villages, and C villages. We had A team, B team, C team, A payoff team, and B payoff team. So this was really like an army. But everyone was great. It was actually fun. So C is an uninvolved third party who can punish B. For every 2 rupee coin that C chooses to spend, B loses 10 rupees. So, it's a standard game. The first mover, whom we call A, gets a certain amount of money. It was 1 day's wages. He can opt out. He can just keep the money and go home. Or he can send it to this person in another village. And then the money becomes 150. Now, person B also had an endowment of 50. So he's just gotten 150 from A, if we're moving along this branch of the game tree. And so B is now sitting pretty on 200 rupees, which is, like 3 or so days' wages. And he has a binary choice to make. He can split it in 2, send half back to A and keep the rest. Or he can just keep all the money. And then C, the uninvolved third party, can punish. He can punish conditional on B, being a free rider, a non-cooperator, a defector. Or he can even punish conditional on B being nice. And in fact, there was a fair amount of spiteful punishment because people said, it's fun. I lose 2 rupees and he loses 10, so I'm a bigger lion than he is. That's how these people talk. What happens? High caste is much more willing than low caste to punish, but only if the victim, person A, was a member of their endogamous community, their jati. And low caste members seem to care less for their in-group members. They punish less. Can this be explained by differences in wealth? An obvious question. No. So, of course, we ran regressions in the paper, but here I just show you the pictures. I look here at those people who own below median land, which is a proxy for wealth. And the high caste guys who own below median land punish much more than the low caste guys. Then I look at those who own at least the median land. I have the same pattern. Another way I proxy for socioeconomic status is education. House, yeah, I did, okay, here's house ownership. So a big indicator of wealth is whether you live in a mud house or a house that's partly, or at least partly of brick. So I look at those very poorest people who live in a mud house. The highs punish more than the lows on average. Same for those who live in a brick or a mixed house. So across the two caste status groups, high and low, the low being the former untouchables, subjects face identical constraints in our game. Absolutely identical. So there shouldn't be any systematic differences in the way they behave under the standard model. Same constraints. Why would they behave differently? But they do. Differences cannot be explained in terms of differences in payoffs, in education, or in wealth. The cultural difference is interesting because earlier work, such as Fair's earlier work, indicates that altruistic sanctioning is a very important means of enforcing contracts. So that means if one group, the low caste, is less good at enforcing contracts in their community, then they can't trade as much, so they'll be poorer. But there's an even more interesting speculative idea. We didn't look at anything but this trust game with third-party punishment, but it seems plausible to think that just as third-party punishment in the context of a trust game that punishes defectors will help support contracting, in the same way, you might suppose that if a lower willingness to punish contract violations is associated with a lower propensity to punish free riders generally, then the low caste would be less able to discipline free riders and thus to organize collective action, which would contribute to the persistence of the caste system. So it's just a speculation. But if you can think of the caste system as doing, among other things, a kind of stigmatizing and humiliation of a whole community, then they would have less in-group loyalty. And if that means they punish less in the context of collective action, then they're not as good at ganging up against the high caste as the high caste is against the low caste, leave alone all the differences in wealth and education and political connections. But even through preferences, it could be that there's a vicious circle. It's just a speculative idea that inequality actually changes preferences, which then make it more difficult to break out of inequality. Hypothesis 2, I mentioned that earlier. Culture shapes the demand for social insurance. So here are, 15 odd countries. And what I'm graphing here, this is a paper by, as you might guess, well, you'll find out in a minute, 3 Swiss economists, and that's not an accident. So what I'm graphing here is the share of people who agree with a question in the World Values Survey. Should government reduce income differences? Well, here's the United States. It's so great to live in a country that's an outlier. We are now among the most unequal countries in the world, and we have the lowest fraction of people who think that government should reduce income differences. And on the other extreme seem to be Poland and Spain. And the gaps are pretty large. It's not like the point. It's not like the teeny little differences in, let's say, the fraction of men, a fraction of boys who were born when women are more under stress. It's not like that. It's really big differences. Why would that be? Well, it's difficult, to make any assessment because all these countries differ in, countless ways. that you could never control for. So let's add 2 bars. This is the Swiss-German part of Switzerland, and this is the non-German part of Switzerland. The authors call it Latin. They're bunching together people who speak French, people who speak Italian, and people who speak Romansh. And this is what Switzerland looks like. The middle light gray area are the German-speaking parts, and the darker areas are what the authors call the Latin-speaking part. And as you can see, there is a clear border, and a number of these borders go through cantons. And so they use a regression discontinuity design with fixed effects for canton, which basically means they're doing a within canton, within state, regression discontinuity design. So they are controlling for the policy environment, because within a canton, absolutely all the rules are identical. And they look at the 29 referenda on social insurance that have occurred in Switzerland since 1980. Switzerland has the wonderful feature that you basically have to vote on every major change. The government doesn't go left or go right without putting it to a referendum. So that produces nice data. And what I'm looking at here is, just as an illustration, three of the things that were voted on, 1988, 2000, and 2000. One is reduce the retirement age. This is the fraction of people that say yes. And these are the Germans, and these are the French. So how does this work? This is the border, and this is bins of voting units. I don't quite remember if that's a municipality or something finer. But anyway, bins that are located right at the language border or further and further away. And here, you're on the French side. And what's clear is, as soon as you're on the French side, you jump up, and everybody wants to reduce the retirement age. Here, it's a question of making the retirement age more flexible, and here it's a question of keeping women's retirement age rather than making it higher. So you have a consistent pattern, and there's a nice picture in their paper which has a whole lot more panels like this, and in every, or almost every one, you see the same kind of gap. So in their regression discontinuity design, using data from all these referenda and controlling for lots of factors that are individually varying, like education, unemployment status, age, the German group still has a much lower demand than the Latin group for social insurance. So it seems clear that cultural differences, not differences in constraint, cause the differences. I mean, maybe there's multiple equilibria here. You can't say, but it's clear at least that culture seems to be able to sustain very strong differences in demand, even in the absence of any difference in what an economist would call a fundamental resource technology constraint. So to sum up, Deirdre McCloskey has this really funny piece called P and S in the Journal of Economic History. P and S, what do they stand for? Prudence and Solidarity. So prudence is just a kind of catch-all for all the things economists traditionally have looked at. And traditionally, Deirdre would say, oh, well, economists want to base everything on prudence. So if prices go up or prices go down, we all adjust optimally, and that explains the world. But solidarity, what he means is, well, he talks a lot about being a gentleman, about virtue, about fairness, other kinds of concerns. He argues are very, very important. So he's really arguing about putting cultural variables into the economic model. And then he imagines the following heckler defending the standard economic model, which has, of course, fixed preferences, the same for all groups, so so variable, culture is never variable. And that guy would say, give me a break. I'm not in the business of explaining all behavior. I propose merely to explain some portion, and in many cases, a large portion. well, that's a plausible objection. If the changes in preferences from the kinds of framing effects we've discussed just have a level effect, like in coherent arbitrariness, that Social Security number experiment I showed you about a minute ago, if it's just that, we value everything more, we value everything less, depending upon an anchor, then at least we wouldn't be able to explain level effects, but we could still explain responses to changes in constraints. But the evidence suggests that changes in constraints are the things that change the preferences. Example, a rise in the minimum wage, the reservation wage falls. No, it rises. Sorry about that. The reservation wage rises. That is what I'd call an entitlement effect. Okay, so this was a little mistake. Okay. Caste in settings where it is salient. The high caste work ethic seems to fall because the need to achieve seems to fall, because the frame cues a self-concept in which you're the overseer. You're not the worker. The second caste experiment I described to you was one where low caste willingness to enforce norms is lower than high caste willingness to enforce norms. Why? We don't know. Maybe because the kinds of constraints that low caste people face makes them feel fatalistic. I can't control the world, I can't even control my life. Or maybe the rules that bar low caste people from enjoying honors, from getting stars. I mean, they wouldn't even be allowed to participate in a star program. The fact that they've never been able to sort of stand up tall, wear beautiful clothes, and enjoy the kind of honors that make such a difference in most people's lives. Maybe that kind of grinds them down and distance themselves from the very identity that is the source of their undoing. So here we have a framing effect, sort of a frame switching effect, and here we have a permanent kind of change in the frame as a result of the conditions in which low caste people live. And then a third example that I didn't take the time to talk about, but it's certainly a very persuasive example, at least to me, is work by Lindbeck and Nieberg, who try to explain the effect of the big delay, a one-generation delay, according to their data, in the reduction in sort of work hours and other indications of work ethic that followed the expansion of the welfare state. So the Western European countries, by and large, had a big expansion in the welfare state in the 1940s. But the big expansion in people wanting to be on the dole was one generation later. So they have a model where parents who are altruistic, love their children, certainly couldn't commit, even if they wanted to not help their children in times of hardship, have an interest in inculcating the work ethic as long as the children will come to them in times of hardship. But if the state is going to guarantee a decent level of living to the children, the parents won't have to help the kids out, and the parents no longer need to inculcate the work ethic, particularly since inculcating the work ethic might come at a cost to the children's happiness, because not all kids are able to be successful in jobs. So why make your kids suffer if the state will help them out? So here's an idea where a change in a constraint, which should make everybody better off, namely there's more insurance, changes the preferences people have in such a way that the externalities, that the kind of disincentive and distortion problems that arise from welfare are magnified one generation later. So the takeaway message is that there's an old view: institutions are the rules of the game. They shape the constraints, and they shape our beliefs about what other people will do and what we think other people will believe we will do. And the new view that I've tried to argue here is that there are framing effects on preferences, just like there are framing effects on perception, and there are effects of institutions on self-concepts and worldviews. As sociologists, many would say we have multiple self-concepts, multiple worldviews, and the particular frame that we find ourselves in shapes which one is more salient, which in turn shapes our preferences. So I feel that the big research agenda for the kinds of people sitting in this very room are to investigate the causal influences on preferences, which is a very difficult thing to do. But just to inspire you, I give you one more comment on visual framing effects. So this is our familiar illusion. And this illusion, according to this man Siegel and his co-authors, is completely absent in some undeveloped societies. In the West, the illusion is strongest. And these authors hypothesize that the exposure to carpentered corners of modern environments, places just like the room we're in now, may have led to certain visual habits that perpetuate this illusion. So this is a quote from Joe Henrich's paper, a really fun paper called The Weirdest People in the World, which states, if even a process as apparently basic as visual perception can show substantial variation across populations, what kinds of psychological process can we be sure will not vary? So it's a wide open world. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for both of you for very nice